One of the greatest achievements of the Moche people was their ceramic portrait vessels. These vessels were for the most part created in the southern region of Peru. They have been found in the Chicama, Moche, and Buru valleys, as well as a few in Santa Valley. They were not only created to represent an individual, but they were also used to hold liquids. It is still unknown why these portrait vessels were created and whom they would represent, as well as if they held another purpose other than holding liquids. This is due to the fact that very few Moche sites have actually been excavated, but due to the archives and study from UCLA, researchers have been able to piece together some of the puzzle. The Moche portrait vessels that have been excavated and studied are now in museums or are part of private collections, and 95% of them were most likely looted by grave robbers, so their provenance is unknown. We know that the Moche civilization thrived from AD 100 to 800 and were a people devoted to their gods and sacrificed rituals. So what exactly are portrait vessels? Portrait vessels are ceramic vessels in the form of human heads. Most of them are stirrup spout vessels, but they were also made in the forms of bowls and jars. Moche ceramics have been divided into 5 phases by Rafael Larco Oil, but the exact dates are unknown. These stages are defined by changes in the forms of decoration of the ceramics. Phase 1 and 2 portrait vessels were more generic, while phases 3 and 4 were more individualized and show a sense of personality and character. In Phase 5, the only portrait vessels being created were generic ones, and the reason is still unknown. Most of these portrait vessels portray adult males, but some children have been depicted as well. These were probably the younger counterparts of the adult males. There have been no female portrait vessels found to this date. The ceramic artists who created these vessels were incredibly skillful in being able to capture the facial features and individualize each portrait through altering of embellishments or head wraps or scars on the face. Researchers have discovered that it is possible to identify the same individual in several portraits, but it is very difficult to find 2 identical portraits of the same individual. One individual, who has been named Cut Lip, has been identified in over 40 portrait vessels, but through different stages of his life. He has been named Cut Lip because of the scar on his upper lip. The vessels were made with terracotta and painted with white clay and other red clay and fired and used to rock to make them smooth. In phases 3 and 4 and even 5, the portrait vessels were made from a mold. It's kind of like a modern day assembly line of the basic foundation of the vessel. The details were individually created by the ceramic artist. In phases 3 and 4, there was an abundance of different accessories that individualized each portrait and gave the individual character. Headdresses could be depicted as several forms of headcloths, wrapped around the head and tied in the back, or a cloth that covered the entire upper part of the head, or as a cloth that encircles the head and only leaving the face visible. Apart from headcloths, some vessels were decorated with headbands that were decorated with geometric patterns. Another option were head rings that were worn over the headcloths and were usually decorated with animal heads or wings. Some of these portrait vessels were decorated with ear ornaments, nose ornaments, necklaces, and individual face and neck paint. It is not accurately known why these male individuals were portrayed in vessels, but we have to assume that they were important figures in their societies. Painted onto their ceramics, the Moche narrated their ritual combats and how the defeated were sacrificed to their gods. They have been full-figure portraits that are depicted as portrait head vessels as well, and the full-figure portraits give us a little bit more insight into the individual's identity. Because of this, we know that some of the portrait head individuals were warriors and most likely were the ones who had been defeated in their combat battles and were sacrificed to the gods. Some cultures could interpret this ritual as barbaric, but to the Moche, they saw their combat as ceremonial rather than violently barbaric. It could very well be interpreted that the portrait vessels served to commemorate honor for the defeated and sacrificed. In Richard Brilliant's book, Portraiture, he begins with a quote, "Neither do I pass them by. I, too, am drawn to the avid contemplation of Roman and all other portraits because they give life to historical persons, freed from the bonds of mortality." I find this incredibly interesting because it is so difficult to understand this ancient culture when the research has been limited. Yet here we have a small portion of the portal vessels that allow us to encounter people who lived hundreds of years ago. I believe it was in Donan's book that he said we should think of these portraits as a crucifixion of Christ. I thought this was incredibly strange, but after a while I saw the connection. The Moche people sacrificed themselves, as did Christ, and both were commemorated in their respectful forms of portraiture. Like Brilliant stated, portraiture gives life to historical persons and makes them immortal. But we may not know with certainty what and hows and whos of the Moche people, but it is interesting to see with what little research has been done, the individuals of the ancient civilization.